quite clearly. I make the point quite clearly, President, that this is a shocking bill. It's a bill that's been conceived poorly by the government. It's a bill with a bad process behind it. It's a bill that seeks greater powers and greater control over Victorians. Senior legal figures, the Law Institute, the barristers, the Bar Institute or the Bar Council, and others have made their points very clearly that this bill is flawed, and I'm going to step my way through some of the aspects of their contribution because I think these eminent bodies have actually made a very serious set of points. The Law Institute, in its 10th of November 2021 statements, made it clear does not support the bill in its current form. The Law Institute went further. It said there is a place for a development of a legal framework for emergency powers, but it said the Law Institute is of the firm view does not satisfactorily or sufficiently protect the rights of Victorians, and in a number of ways the bill feels short of achieving its stated objectives. The bill places a significant amount of power in the hands of the Premier and the Minister to declare a pandemic and make pandemic orders, respectively. The Law Institute calls for independent oversight and scrutiny to ensure that legal protections are justifiable, transparent and do not unduly limit human rights. This position paper sets out the Law Institute's specific concerns, and they're summarised in the introduction of the paper. A pandemic declaration can be in place for an indefinite period and very wide powers conferred. Many powers appear to be an unnecessary infringement on democratic rights and freedoms, with little oversight offered by a truly independent body. There appears to be no quantifiable time frame. The process for review of detention does not provide for an independent external merits review. Further concerns include the use of punitive and coercive approaches, and the protections relating to the information gathered from public health purposes do not go far enough, and provisions relating to the use of disclosure of contact tracing information and for other permitted purposes should be carefully reconsidered. They make recommendations about strengthening the oversight, perhaps by empowering the Ombudsman. And the Ombudsman's spoken today, and she has made it very clear that this bill does not have adequate checks, does not have adequate controls, even with the proposals that the government has announced in the last few hours about how it wants to modify this. To resource and adequately empower the Scrutiny of Acts and Regulations Committee is another recommendation they make, to amend section 165AK4 so that it is targeted and specific, and the absurd introduction of the contributes of attributes, or of the concept of attributes being there in that section was a major mistake by the government. I understand that they have now stepped back from that major mistake. To especially provide for those empowered by the bill are required to properly consider and act compatibly with human rights. The bill should provide for an external merits review of all decisions relating to detention and that VCAT be given jurisdiction. I note that our amendments do that. To increase the likelihood of public confidence and compliance, there should not be law enforcement emphasis behind the creation of lockdown laws. And the terms of imprisonment should not apply in respect of matters arising from the bill in the way they are, because they're excessive in the context of breach of pandemic laws. These are all legitimate points made by the Law Institute, and I note the importance of the contribution of the barristers too, the 60 barristers who came out and spoke so publicly and so clearly about the weaknesses of the bill. And I say that the community should be listening to senior barristers of this type, senior barristers who are able to make a proper contribution and to do so in a way that actually strengthens the understanding of this bill in the community. I want to, in turning to the Bar Council's recommendations, the Bar Council has provided a submission to both the Department of Health and an expert group. This is very late in the piece. Early November, they're finally being given some ability to talk. The Bar Council's submission addresses both the intent of the bill and specific sections and recommends a number of amendments. The Bar Council emphasises that the rule of law, the sovereignty of Parliament, the checks and balances of our democratic system must be respected, and even in times of emergency or crisis. And even in times of emergency or crisis is important words. These are the times when there is a weakening of our democratic traditions. These are the times where the checks and balances are overridden. These are the times where the risk to democracy is at its greatest. And I say we need to be extremely cautious with these matters. It may be convenient for government to have the broadest and most flexible powers. However, the rule of law cannot bow to convenience, says the Bar Council. Legislation which seeks to plan for the future must do so consistent with the respect for well-tested checks, balances and our legal system. And we've seen so much over the last 18 months in this state as the government has repeatedly again and again overridden the checks and balances and the long democratic tradition, the 1,000-year history of democratic voting and parliamentary democracy. The idea that that the King's officers in old-fashioned parlance, that is people employed by the Crown, would be directing the Parliament and directing where people can go and what people can do within this Parliament, is a direct repudiation of the Bill of Rights. It's a direct repudiation of the Article 9 respect that is required, and a direct repudiation of the protections of people going about, as MPs going about their work in a proper way. It must be recognised that the parliamentary oversight at number 7 in the Bar Council's contribution, that the Minister's power to make pandemic orders are extraordinarily broad. The Bar Council believes the bill provides grossly insufficient parliamentary supervision of the Minister's exercise of that power. The bill introduces a disallowance power, but it's a pathetic disallowance power. It requires SARC's input. It requires both chambers to vote to disallow. This is something that will never, ever happen. And I say that the disallowance power is an incredibly important check, and the disallowance power is a way in which the Parliament and the people through the Parliament can actually, in a serious way, block some of the extreme activities of government. Our amendments will seek to ensure that disallowance can be provided in the normal way under the subordinate legislation in the normal way, provide that either House on its own approach can actually disallow a regulation in effect, in this case an order. The power to disallow a pandemic order is conditional, as the Bar Council says on the Scrutiny of Regulations Committee recommending disallowance of SARC reporting a failure to table the order in Parliament. I say it is inappropriate for SARC to be appointed gatekeeper, which can shield the Minister's exercise of power from ordinary processes of parliamentary scrutiny. That's what the Bar Council says, and I agree. The disallowance provision to be by both Houses of Parliament. This is an unacceptable departure from the ordinary process, says the Bar Council. And I say, well, I'm not making it up. It's at 8.2 in the Bar Council submission. Ms Terpstra, you may want to over Westminster tradition, but I don't.
Order. Yes, Ms Terpstra.
Mr Davis is aggressively pointing in this chamber, and I ask that he stop.
I would... Yes, Mr Davis.
Faced incessant barrage from Ms Terpstra for 5 minutes, non-stop, just yakking and yelling out constantly. Now, I say, she can actually...
Thank you, Mr Davis. I take your point. Ms Terpstra.
Thank you, Madam Acting President. As I said before, Mr Davis was aggressively pointing and being hostile and aggressive towards me in this chamber, and I ask that he desist with that behaviour and debate this in the manner which is fit for this Parliament.
Thank you, Ms Terpstra. I think the score is 1-1, and if you could both try and let's try and keep today calm. It's going to be a long day, and yeah, I'm sure you're on the speakers list, Ms Terpstra. Mr Davis, please continue.
Acting President, I proceed with the Bar Council's submission here. The Bar Council recommends as a minimum the bill be amended to ensure that the Parliament has the power to disallow a pandemic order in whole or in part, and that is not conditional on the recommendation of SARC or any other body. Our amendments seek to do that. Disallowance be by passing a motion in either House of Parliament. Our amendment seeks to do that. There is a protection for persons who are alleged to have failed to comply with a parliamentary order that is subsequently disallowed. That is an important point. The breadth of the power to make pandemic orders is the next section that the Bar Council document deals with. And it makes a series of points. The Bar recommends the bill be amended so that the Minister's power to make pandemic orders be limited to specific actions such as restricting movement, restricting the carrying out on certain activities, mandating the wearing of protective equipment. Any catch-all power, a power that says any, is too much. Once a pandemic declaration is made, the Minister has very broad power to make any order. When I asked a group of barristers what any order meant, it means exactly as it says, any order whatsoever. And that is how broad the government has sought its power. The power is constrained only by the Minister's subjective belief that the order is reasonably necessary to protect public health. The Bar Council goes on, any catch-all power to make any other orders be limited in time unless approved by both houses. The Minister's power to make orders conditional on a Minister being reasonably satisfied that the order is necessary to reduce or eliminate the serious risk to health. Now, I say all these are reasonable, that the order is proportionate to the harm and inconvenience is likely to cause, that the order is consistent with the principles of 5 to 10 in the Public Health and Wellbeing Act, and the Minister comply with Section 38 of the Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities. These are all reasonable requests from the Bar Council. These are eminent lawyers, eminent barristers who have good understanding of our traditions and our laws. And I say the government still has not listened to them. And the Ombudsman's words today should resonate in everyone's ears. The Ombudsman's words that basically say the checks and balances are not up to scratch. They are not up to scratch, even with the government's proposed amendments. You should go and listen, Mr Lean, to what the Ombudsman said. No, I'm just telling you that it doesn't go far enough, and that is what the Ombudsman said today, Mr Lean, and you should go and listen to the sound of the Ombudsman on the radio as she laid out these points. And it's very clear that the government has not listened to the community sufficiently. The amendments that we will seek to move seek to make sure that there's an explicit reference to the Public Health and Wellbeing Act's principles, the accountability, proportionality, collaboration, prevention and precaution to pandemic declarations and orders. We seek to ensure that extensions to the pandemic declarations cannot be more than 1 month, and they must be coming back to Parliament each month as time goes forward. That is a very reasonable provision. It is a very reasonable check, very reasonable balance to put in the situation. And we've said that those extensions should also have a special majority, a 60% majority, to ensure that as we've seen today, the government doesn't use a bare majority to crunch things through, to force things through, when that is not the broad view in the Victorian community. We've said there must be briefings, and we have experience with the government and their failure to provide proper briefings. I have been to a number of these briefings with Ms Crozier, and the government has not followed up with information. The government has refused to provide information. I have asked the Chief Health Officer personally and directly to provide me copies of the briefings that he has in his possession, that he has signed to support some of the orders. He has refused to. So no one say this is just the government blocking the release of the health briefings. The Chief Health Officer himself has refused. He refused at a parliamentary committee to even provide the health briefings at request to that committee. Our amendments will also seek to remove the ability to make orders on the basis of personal attributes, including political activity, sexuality, religion, age, etc. Well, that's what's in the bill. That is what is in the bill. It is.
Mr. Lean.
Point of order. Acting President, I usually don't. I usually don't interrupt Mr. Davis like when he's misleading the House, because I'd be interrupting him continually. But I say that I think that on the basis of the statement around the types of classifications that he mentioned is actually completely incorrect. It goes to the bill where it talks about specified classes of person. And I say there's over 730 pieces of that is a legal term in the current statute books, 730 plus where it talks about that particular classes of person. And this is part of the reason why I'm making this point of order is because there has been, I think it's very important people don't conflate this bill. This bill for reasons of...
Mr. Lean, thank you, Mr. Davis.
I'll just finish.
Mr. Lean, thank you. This is you'll certainly have a time to make that contribution.
Yeah, I just think for the safety of the the MPs and the ones that have been threatened because of certain vitriol and misinformation.
Mr. Lean, thank you.
Acting President, Mr. Lean's commentary then is completely out of line. We are having this important debate, and I'd ask you, if he's going to carry on like that you bring him back in a
Thank you, Ms. Crozier.
manner.
I just did.
Thank you, Acting President. Of course it's not a point of order. Of course it's nonsense. And the misinformation that coming out of the government is just extraordinary. They know they've made big mistakes. They know they're trampling on human rights. They know they're doing the wrong thing, Acting President, and they know what they're doing is simply reprehensible. And it cannot stand justification in its current form in any way. This also, the amendments that we will move will also require the written advice in relation to human rights impact tabled under any health order, will require a copy of that written formal advice on which a health order is based to be publicly released, suspend the pandemic orders for which written health advice is not provided, require the Chief Health Officer as advice relating to pandemic declarations be tabled in Parliament, and that includes the retrospective orders that were made historically, and the advices have never ever been released. The formal written advice has never once been released, and the government continues to fight at VCAT the release of the formal written advice. It is in defiance of the House through the motions that have been moved here. It's an arrogant, overweening government, a government that is actually so drunk on its own power, so furious in its own belief and self-belief that it is prepared to override all good governance. I say too that we need to ensure that we restore measures relating to scrutiny and suspension and disallowance of pandemic orders. We need to add a right of appeal to VCAT for any person impacted by a pandemic order. Of course there should be a right of appeal. Of course there should. The Law Institute, the Bar Council have both made that point very strongly. The Law Institute's suggestion that VCAT be tasked with that role is something that we have picked up in our amendments, and we also want to make sure that we block pandemic orders that interfere in the ordinary and full operation of the Victorian Parliament. The absurd mix of orders from a range of different health bureaucrats, salaried health bureaucrats in the department, under the control of the Secretary and the Minister of the department, not able to exercise independent judgment, and frankly a very concerning development as they sought to order the parliament around. Enable either chamber, as I say, to disallow orders. We want to also ensure that warrantless entry into residential premises by authorised officers is not allowed, and the government will need to get a warrant under our amendments. We think that is quite important. We will also seek to establish a parliamentary committee, which would be a subcommittee of the PAAC, the Public Accounts and Estimates Committee, with a non-government majority that would actually be in a position to oversight any such series of orders under the pandemic legislation. And we think that that is reasonable. In other states and jurisdictions, New Zealand, for example, there have been such committees, even in New South Wales. A Green chairs the one, I think, in New South Wales. And this is not what we've had in Victoria. We've actually had a very weak set of arrangements in this state, a very, very weak set of arrangements that have not actually put us in a position where we can go forward. I want to also return to the issue of SARC. And, you know, let me be clear again, the lower house did not have the benefit of the Scrutiny of Acts and Regulations Committee information or report. It was crunched through in just 2 days, 36 hours, and the SARC report is still incomplete. The SARC has written to the Minister and said the committee will write to the Minister seeking further information as to whether or not the pandemic powers and orders may be made or exercised after the Premier has made a pandemic declaration are limited to the areas where the pandemic declaration applies. Pandemic orders made under the new subsection 165A11 must, so far as possible, to do so consistently with their or that subsection's purpose, be interpreted in ways compatible with the human rights. We need to hear this from the Minister for Health. It says that they want to know whether or not it is unlawful for the Minister for Health to make pandemic orders in a way incompatible with the Charter of Human Rights or fail to give proper consideration to a charter right. You know, the list is quite long of matters that are still in dispute and still unclear. We have no such letter from the Minister, no such information from the Minister, and why are we proceeding when there is no haste in this? This could have been dealt with sensibly, practically over a long period of time. As I said earlier on, the government has had more than 6 months to deal with this. But let's understand the context of where we are here. This is a situation where the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, has had a very severe impact on Victoria. The state government has mismanaged the whole process with the COVID-19 pandemic. We've got the terrible trifecta, the worst of all outcomes in this state, the worst of all outcomes. On one hand, we had the longest lockdowns of any jurisdiction in the world, the longest lockdowns. That has its amazingly negative consequence on our businesses and our kids. At the same time, in Australia, we actually had the worst death rate by far. And we've even heard today about St Basil's and about how the state government failed to get infection control up to scratch, a responsibility of the state government. And we've heard today how the state government's failure in that respect is actually at the core of some of the failings under this pandemic. That is exactly what I was trying to say, Ms Crozier. There does need to be a Royal Commission. It needs to examine the management and mismanagement of this pandemic by Daniel Andrews and his government. But it needs to also examine the damage done to our children, the damage done to businesses, the damage done to families because of the unnecessary and sharp pandemic rules that have been put in place week after week, month after month, decisions that have been made capriciously by this government, decisions that have been made arbitrarily by this government, decisions that have been made in spite of medical evidence. We have still never seen the evidence for the curfew. That extraordinary decision to make a curfew for the whole of the state and just lock down the state with a sharp, harsh curfew. What an outrageous decision. And who was consulted? The Chief Commissioner didn't support it. Who actually came up with the curfew? It doesn't. It was Andrews, and it was in his office in the bunker. That's what they call his office. They call it the bunker. And people in the Public Health Division of the Department of Health, who I occasionally talk to.
Minister Lean.
Point of order. Similar to my previous point of order, where I think people would be best sticking to what's actually in the bill, particularly in this debate, given that there's been, I think, going outside the bill and actually not making up what's in the bill for purposes of that. A number of MLCs have been threatened by this vitriol. A number of MPs, a number of MPs have been threatened to be hung today because and I think that we need to be. I think we'll be very careful,
Thank you.
very careful in misleading the House on what is in this bill.
Mr. Lean, this is not a point of order. It's debating. There is, as lead speaker, Mr. Davis does have the opportunity for a broad to go very broadly, which he is doing. However, Mr. Lean, I did hear your comments towards Mr. Lean, and I would ask you to withdraw.
I withdraw that he's a clown. I have to say, Acting President, across the bureaucracy there is a reference to the bunker, which is the Premier's office over at 1 Treasury Place, and orders come out of there that bypass the Public Health Division. The Public Health Division is often doing catch-up as it seeks to backfill with support. And let me just say, Acting President, it's very clear that the bunker has got a lot of this wrong. A lot of the failures under this pandemic are directly and personally the fault of Daniel Andrews because of his overreach, because of his control of the whole system, because of his overriding of good advice from departments, good advice from experts. The reason we've never seen many of the health orders is because they don't bear scrutiny. The reason we've not seen many of the health orders is because they've had to be built and made up as the government has gone forward from a press conference to orders later in the day or the next day. That is the way it has often occurred, and that is why it is very important that things like the curfew, we see the full information behind those decisions. On this bill, Acting President, I say very clearly, this bill doesn't have the checks, doesn't have the balances, doesn't have the controls that are there to enable us to be confident that this bill will not be misused. All of the evidence is that this is a lockdown bill, a bill that is going to be used by Daniel Andrews again and again to lock down Victorians. Our recovery, our rebuild as a state is actually dependent on certainty and predictability. It is not dependent on further lockdowns with this overreach legislation. This legislation that strips away the rights from Victorians, strips away power from communities, and weakens the parliament in a whole series of other ways. I say that we actually need a proper review of this area of legislation. This could have occurred through the last 6 months. The government chose not to do that. They chose to talk to just 3 MPs and not to talk to the broad crossbench or the opposition, or indeed out broadly enough. And the response of senior lawyers is enough to make people understand that the government has got this fundamentally wrong. It is a piece of legislation that is driven by an arrogant Premier. It is driven by a person who wants to take more power to themselves. It is driven by a desire to control, a desire to keep the state locked down, and to do this for some of the basest of motives. These are political motives. The Premier seeks to divide the state. He seeks to create division. He seeks to cause damage through his misunderstanding of the impact of these laws and these approaches that he's adopted through this whole period. So I have to say that I am persuaded by the information that has been presented to us by the senior lawyers. I am persuaded by the information that I have seen. Acting President, if I could ask that the clerks distribute my amendments, that would be much appreciated.
I'm afraid they're not quite complete, Mr Davis.
That can happen just shortly then, can it? Is that...
Maybe with your the next speaker.
I'm happy to do that as required, but they should be, they're close, Keir, are they? Very good. We will indeed indicate that we will look at the other pieces of amendments that have been brought forward by Ms Cumming, by some of the independents, by indeed the government. And we will look closely at all of those pieces of proposed amendment, and we will look at them fairly and come up with sensible responses to each and every one of them.